A homeowner in Ohio spent $40,000 fixing her foundation, and 6 months later, the cracks came back wider than before. Somewhere between the first estimate and the final invoice, something went terribly wrong, and almost nobody could explain why. What she didn't know is that the real disaster wasn't the crack in her basement wall. It was a decision made 3 years earlier, one so small that not a single inspector flagged it. If you're the kind of person who wants to know what's really happening underneath the homes you live in, buy, or build, subscribe now, because every week we dig into the hidden construction failures that quietly drain thousands of dollars from unsuspecting homeowners. And this one is about to get personal. It starts almost always the same way. A small hairline crack appears somewhere along a basement wall or across a garage floor. It's thin, barely visible, easy to dismiss as nothing more than the house settling. Most homeowners walk past it for months. Some walk past it for years. It doesn't leak. It doesn't widen overnight. It just sits there, quiet and unthreatening, blending into the background of daily life. But here's where everything changed for the homeowner in Ohio. During a heavy spring storm, water began seeping through that same hairline crack, pooling in the corner of her finished basement. She called a repair company the next morning, and within an hour, a truck was in her driveway, with a crew ready to fix it fast. That single phone call, made in a moment of panic, would end up costing her far more than the crack itself. The company arrived, looked at the wall for less than 10 minutes, and offered a solution that sounded simple. Inject epoxy into the crack, seal it shut, and guarantee it wouldn't leak again. It sounded reasonable. It sounded fast. And it was completely wrong for her situation. This is where most homeowners get blindsided, because not all foundation cracks are created equal, and treating every crack the same way is one of the most expensive mistakes in residential construction. A crack caused by simple concrete shrinkage during curing is very different from a crack caused by soil pressure pushing against the wall from outside. One is cosmetic, the other is structural. And no amount of epoxy in the world can stop a wall that is actively being pushed inward by tons of wet, expanding soil. What happened next surprised even the crew that installed the repair. Within a few months, the epoxy seal held, technically doing its job of blocking water. But the wall kept bowing inward, millimeter by millimeter, invisible to the eye, but very visible to a level and a measuring tape. The real problem, the one nobody diagnosed, was never the water. It was the soil outside pressing against an aging foundation wall, with nowhere for that pressure to go. To understand why this happens, picture the ground surrounding a house the way you'd picture a sponge sitting next to a wall. When it rains, that sponge soaks up water and swells. Clay-heavy soil, which covers huge portions of the United States, expands dramatically when wet and contracts when dry. This constant swelling and shrinking creates a slow, relentless push and pull against foundation walls, year after year, season after season. Most homeowners never notice this cycle happening beneath their feet because it moves too slowly to see in real time. But foundations remember every single cycle. Now here's the detail almost nobody catches during a home inspection. A standard home inspection is visual only. Inspectors are not required to dig, measure wall deflection with precision tools, or evaluate long-term soil behavior. They look, they note visible cracks, and they move on. This means a home can pass inspection with flying colors while the foundation is already leaning, almost imperceptibly, under sustained pressure that will only get worse. This is exactly what happened to a young couple who bought a charming brick home outside Dallas. The inspection report listed minor cosmetic cracking, no active water intrusion. They closed on the house feeling confident. 18 months later, doors throughout the home started sticking. Kitchen cabinets no longer aligned properly. A crack that once measured 1/16 of an inch had grown to nearly half an inch. What looked like ordinary wear and tear was actually a foundation slowly losing its fight against the soil surrounding it. At first, it doesn't seem like a serious problem. A sticking door gets blamed on humidity. An uneven floor gets blamed on an old house settling naturally. Homeowners live with these small annoyances for months, sometimes years, unaware that each one is a symptom pointing back to the same underlying cause. This is precisely why foundation issues become so expensive. The longer the real cause goes undiagnosed, the more damage accumulates in the background, hidden behind drywall, tile, and paint. But the biggest mistake hadn't even happened yet. The couple eventually called a contractor, and instead of getting a proper structural evaluation, they got a quick fix. The contractor recommended what's called a wall anchor system, a legitimate repair method used across the country, but only when installed under the right conditions, with enough surrounding yard space to properly tension the anchors into stable soil. Their lot was tight, hemmed in by a neighboring property line just a few feet away. The anchors were installed anyway, without enough room to achieve proper holding strength. This hidden detail changes everything about how a repair either succeeds or fails. A repair method that works beautifully on one property can completely fail on another, simply because of soil conditions, lot size, water table depth, or the type of foundation involved. There is no universal fix for foundation problems. Yet countless companies apply the same solution to every house they see, almost like handing out the same medication to every patient, regardless of diagnosis. Within a year, the anchors on the Dallas home showed signs of loosening. The wall continued its slow inward lean, now visibly bowing enough that a level revealed nearly 2 inches of deflection from top to bottom. What should have stabilized the wall permanently had instead become a temporary patch on a much deeper issue. The couple was now facing a second repair, layered on top of the first, with costs climbing well beyond what a proper diagnosis would have required from the very beginning. Now comes the part that costs homeowners the most money, and it has nothing to do with the crack itself. It's the sequence of decisions made after the crack is discovered. Choosing the fastest quote instead of the most accurate diagnosis, choosing the cheapest repair instead of the correct one for that specific soil and structure, choosing a company that sells one type of fix instead of an engineer who evaluates the actual cause before recommending anything at all. Professional structural engineers approach this completely differently than repair companies whose primary business is selling one specific product. A qualified engineer starts by examining the type of foundation, whether it's a poured concrete wall, a block foundation, or a slab. They study the direction and pattern of cracking because horizontal cracks, stair-step cracks, and vertical cracks each tell a different story about what's happening underground. They check for bowing using precise measurements rather than a casual glance. They consider the age of the home, the grading of the yard, gutter placement, and how water moves across the property during rainfall. This is the difference between guessing and diagnosing, and it's the single biggest factor separating a homeowner who spends a reasonable amount fixing their foundation correctly from one who spends tens of thousands of dollars fixing it multiple times. Consider two nearly identical homes on the same street, both showing similar foundation cracks. In the first home, the owner calls a repair company that specializes in one method, and, unsurprisingly, that company recommends exactly that method, regardless of whether it addresses the actual cause. In the second home, the owner hires an independent structural engineer first, someone with no financial incentive tied to a specific repair product. The engineer identifies that poor grading around the house is directing rainwater straight toward the foundation instead of away from it, something a simple downspout extension and regraded soil could resolve for a few $100s, long before any structural repair becomes necessary. That's the twist most people never expect. Sometimes the most expensive-looking problem has the least expensive solution, buried beneath the panic of seeing a crack in your basement wall. And sometimes the opposite is true, where a seemingly small crack is actually the surface symptom of a much larger structural failure quietly developing underground. There was one critical mistake almost nobody noticed during the entire process in these situations, and it happened before any contractor ever showed up. It happened when the homeowners skipped a soil and drainage evaluation entirely. Water is, without exaggeration, the single greatest threat to residential foundations across the United States. Not earthquakes, not poor concrete mixing. Water. Whether it comes from heavy rainfall, poor grading, broken gutters, or a rising water table, water is almost always the hidden force behind foundation failure. Yet it's the factor most frequently ignored during quick repairs. Picture a house where the ground slopes gently toward the foundation instead of away from it. Every time it rains, water collects right at the base of the walls instead of draining safely into the yard. Over years, this creates a saturated zone of soil pressing directly against the foundation, exactly the kind of sustained pressure that eventually forces cracks to form and walls to bow. The fix for this particular cause has nothing to do with epoxy, anchors, or piers. It has everything to do with regrading the landscape and properly directing gutters and downspouts away from the house. Something so simple it's often overlooked entirely in favor of dramatic, expensive structural solutions. This is the invisible danger inside so many foundation repair mistakes. Homeowners jump straight to the most severe, most expensive fix, without ever confirming whether a smaller, cheaper solution might solve the underlying cause first. It's the construction equivalent of performing surgery before checking if rest and physical therapy could have healed the injury on their own. Now picture the correct process, done the way an experienced professional would actually handle it. First comes a full exterior inspection, checking grading, gutters, downspouts, and how water flows across the property during a real rainstorm. Next comes an interior inspection, measuring crack width, direction, and any wall deflection with precision tools rather than a visual guess. Then comes soil analysis, because clay-heavy soil, sandy soil, and rocky soil all behave completely differently under moisture changes, and the repair method must match the soil, not the other way around. Only after this complete picture comes together does a genuine expert recommend a specific repair, whether that's carbon fiber strips for minor bowing, steel I-beams for moderate movement, wall anchors for homes with enough yard space, or helical piers driven deep into stable soil for more severe structural settlement. Each of these methods exists for a reason, and each one fails when applied to the wrong situation, exactly like what happened with the anchors installed on a lot too small to support them properly. This is also where cheap versus professional becomes strikingly clear. A cheap repair often treats the visible symptom, sealing a crack, filling a gap, patching a wall, and stops there. A professional repair treats the underlying cause, understanding why the crack formed in the first place, and addressing that root issue so the same problem doesn't quietly return 18 months later, disguised as a new crack a few inches away from the original. Think back to the Ohio homeowner from the very beginning, the one who spent $40,000 only to watch the cracks return. What actually happened, once a structural engineer finally examined the property months later, was heartbreaking in its simplicity. The original epoxy injection sealed the crack perfectly, exactly as promised. but it did nothing to address the soil pressure still pushing against the wall from outside. The wall kept moving. New stress concentrated at the edges of the old repair, and predictably, new cracks formed exactly where the old repair met the untouched concrete. She hadn't been scammed in the traditional sense. She had simply been sold the wrong solution for her actual problem, a mistake that happens to homeowners across the country every single day. The engineer's final report told the real story clearly. Combined with poor exterior grading and undersized gutters that dumped rainwater directly against the foundation during every storm, her home had been fighting a losing battle against water for years before that first crack ever appeared. The $40,000 epoxy repair addressed maybe 10% of the actual problem. How could this have been prevented from the very beginning? The answer is almost disappointingly simple. A proper structural evaluation before any repair work begins. Correcting grading and drainage issues as a first step, since they're often the cheapest and most effective long-term solution. Choosing repair companies that recommend based on diagnosis rather than companies that sell a single product regardless of the underlying cause. And understanding that a foundation crack is rarely the actual problem. It's simply the messenger revealing a problem that already exists somewhere else on the property. This single shift in thinking, treating a crack as a symptom rather than the disease itself, is the difference between homeowners who spend a reasonable amount once and homeowners who spend tens of thousands of dollars repeatedly chasing a problem that keeps resurfacing in new places. There's something almost poetic about how forgiving concrete and soil can be when problems are caught early, and how unforgiving they become once neglect compounds over years. A crack noticed and properly diagnosed within the first year might cost a few $100s to correct through simple drainage improvements. That same underlying cause, left unaddressed for 5 or 10 years, can escalate into wall replacement, foundation underpinning, and structural repairs costing tens of thousands of dollars, all stemming from the exact same root cause that could have been fixed for the price of a few bags of soil and a downspout extension. This is why the smartest homeowners, the ones who never end up in these expensive situations, treat every crack with curiosity rather than panic. They ask questions before signing contracts. They request soil evaluations before agreeing to structural repairs. They get second opinions from engineers who have no financial stake in which repair method gets chosen. They understand that grading and drainage deserve just as much attention as the crack itself, because water is almost always the silent force setting these disasters into motion, long before anyone notices a problem at all. By the end of it, both the couple outside Dallas and the homeowner in Ohio eventually got their foundations properly stabilized, but only after paying for the wrong repair first, learning the hard way that speed and confidence from a contractor don't automatically mean accuracy. The permanent fix, once correctly diagnosed, turned out to be far less dramatic and far less expensive than either family expected. Proof that the real disaster was never the crack itself. It was the rush to fix it without ever understanding why it happened in the first place. Every home sitting quietly on its foundation right now is having a slow, invisible conversation with the soil beneath it, shaped by rainfall, drainage, and time. Most homeowners never think about that conversation until a crack forces them to. But now you know what to look for, what questions to ask, and why the fastest fix is so rarely the right one. If this kind of investigation into what's really happening behind the walls of American homes fascinates you, come back next week, because there's always another hidden problem waiting to be uncovered. Another mistake quietly costing homeowners thousands, and another story worth telling before it happens to you too.